Hey kids, know what time it is? It's about 9:30 East Coast time, when we're recording this anyway. Well, so this is the Mentionables podcast. I'm Joel Furches.
And I'm Caleb Johnston.
Caleb, you made your first appearance, last year?
Yeah, back right at the end of the year, I believe.
Okay, cool. Caleb came on as the Mentionable Lovecraft expert on that episode. And we were talking about the argument for God's existence from cosmic heart. In that episode, just go check it out. It's impossible to encapsulate. For me, anyway. Caleb, you want to give it a try?
It is about as Lovecraftian as you could ever get on an apologetics podcast.
Yeah,
that pretty much summed it up.
It's actually been one of our most popular episodes.
Excellent.
I think it got somewhere in the 50s or 60s downloads. Our most popular episode is our initial episode, which is sitting at around 98 downloads. You can tell how popular our podcast is. Every episode gets around 20 downloads, so we've got about 20 followers. Hi, guys. All right.
20 ain't bad.
No, not at all.
They're loyal.
Well, listeners, you're going to have to buckle down and get used to Caleb's soothing southern drawl because he may end up as a semi-permanent co-host here on the MPC. One thing we've been lacking is consistent co-hosting. Caleb isn't one of the core founding members, but he's eagerly jumped on every single project the M's have done, so he's more active than some of the founding members are. We're going to try this out, and I'm going to see if we can keep up with Caleb's unique brand of Christian apologetics. That out of the way, today on the Mentionables. Knock, knock. Who's there? The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society who? Look, you think this is some kind of joke? Also, a Christian and a scientist walk into a bar. Also not a joke. Caleb, you're sort of new to this whole podcasting thing. You want I should go first, show you how it's done, and then you close us out?
That sounds good to me, Joe.
All right. So my topic today is one of perennial frustration to the Christian community at large. It's this lingering tension that seems to exist between the church and science. Now, if you're like me, and you come from a highly conservative church background, you know what I'm talking about. There's such a distant estrangement between the broad scientific endeavor and the church that the church is all like, you know what? Fine, we'll do our own science. Caleb, I think you and I have roughly similar backgrounds. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to illustrate this tension, I want to cite a play-turned-movie titled Inherit the Wind. Caleb, Inherit the Wind. Recognize it at all?
Can't say that I've ever seen that one. It does sound familiar, though.
All right. Well, this is a performance which dramatizes the so-called Scopes monkey trials. This was sort of a highly politicized event in the 1920s when a high school teacher was put on trial for teaching evolution in schools in your general vicinity, Caleb.
So kind of like a reverse God's Not Dead.
Exactly. And I feel like the movie God's Not Dead 2 was possibly riffing off the Scopes monkey trials a little bit. Because in the movie, the Inherit the Wind movie, you have this sharp, young high school teacher who's got a college education and actually knows his stuff, being interviewed by this stodgy Southern lawyer with, the Maybury folk townspeople gathered around with their angry pitchforks and shovels. Metaphorically speaking, they don't actually have pitchforks and shovels in the courtroom, but the Southern lawyer's trying to, make fun of evolution, like, oh, so you're saying we came from monkeys kind of thing, but very uninformed and uneducated individual, and so it all comes off as these ridiculous banana argument type things, and it makes a mockery of Christians very successfully, is what the movie does. And that's really the crux of the public perception of Christianity, that it's anti-science. Now, the church doesn't exactly fit this perception due to a broad focus that many, if not most, evangelical churches have on the topic of creation versus evolution. Now, this is a subject of discussion which has come up more than occasionally among the Mentionables network, Caleb, I think you've been pretty clear on your thoughts regarding this focus on creationism in the church. You want to outline those thoughts for us?
Yeah, it's something that really shouldn't be a dividing line for us, as I see it. It's one of those secondary issues that too often drives a wedge between fellow believers who are all saved because they believe in grace by faith. But too often we get caught up in the details of young earth, old earth, theistic evolution in a way that isn't productive for us to move forward theologically.
Yeah, I agree. And for the right end of the spectrum, no, not trying to criticize any group of Christians, but the further you move towards the conservative end of the church, the more they see apologetics as focusing on creation versus evolution, right?
Absolutely. I've seen this more than a few times, I would say.
Yeah, so you mention you're an apologist, and immediately they'll start talking about, evolution, fossils, that kind of thing to you, as if that's all that apologetics is.
Exactly.
And you've got institutions like Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research really promoting these scientific arguments against evolution, which is fine for what it is. They have as much right as any group of scientists to pursue and test theories. But then you have people like Ken Ham and Ray Comfort who insist on taking this into evangelism. So, for instance, Comfort has advocated this cold approach where you walk up to some poor schlub on the college campus and go, "So you think we all came from monkeys, do you? Well, if we all came from monkeys, why are there no transitional forms in the fossil record? Explain that, atheists. Now come to Jesus, y'all."
Yep.
Point being is that when your opening pitch is to contradict all the science the person has learned at school, then you are coming off out of the gate giving the impression that you're anti-science, whether you are or not, in your own opinion. Now, I don't think this branch of evangelicalism sees themselves as anti-science. My impression is that they're just anti-institutional science, believing that science ultimately supports their side. What you find among practically every high-profile apologist, though, whose primary focus isn't the subject of origins, is that this focus on arguing creationism is fairly damaging to the church. That's the opinion shared in all the high-profile apologists I know.
I would completely agree with you there, Joel. It's something I've seen firsthand in my own personal experience as well, growing up in a lot of very southern small town churches. The attitude was kind of prevalent there.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll give you an example. I recently began attending a church, and I approached the pastor after attending for several months. I approached the pastor about possibly teaching some apologetics courses there, and he required me to fill out forms and doctrinal statements, which is fine. They deserve to know where I stand before they let me teach. I understand that. They should do that, right? But they also provided me with the doctrinal standards of the church. And right there in the essential doctrine, presumably what you would be required to believe to be a Christian, was six-day creationism. Now think about that. Walking into the church off the street, you'd be asked to embrace literal six-day creationism stance before they considered you for membership, much less a Christian. Now, I want to make this clear to the listeners. I'm not anti-creationism. I'm not currently convinced by young earth creationism, but I don't write that off entirely. I'd be happy to be convinced if given persuasive arguments. I mean, I was brought up in young earth creationism. My parents were bringing me to Answers in Genesis conferences all the time. So that's the background I came out of. And I haven't ditched it entirely. I'm happy to say that, if there's evidence, there's evidence. I'm not convinced currently. I think that everything I've heard has its weak spots. Young earth and even old earth, the way that they kind of reinterpret the text to try to cram science in there seems a little suspect to me. What do you think about Tyler's theory?
Refresh me just a little bit on it. It's probably been 6 months since I read his piece.
Okay, so basically Tyler isn't arguing from the viewpoint of science. He doesn't take...
Yes, the literary take on Genesis.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one that I actually had a professor in college who was very big on that approach and used it not so much to argue one way or another, but to point out, hey, this may not be intended as a scientific text, and I think it's a very solid viewpoint to hang on to, particularly when dealing with non-believers.
Yeah, again, Tyler's not the first one I've heard that from, but given that I publish a lot of his material and I follow his work, he's the one who has educated me the most on that subject. So I know more about it because of him than anybody else. But getting back to this idea of creation versus evolution, regardless of what you end up believing, regardless of what the doctrinal statement of this particular church is, if we can show that Christ was a historical person and rose from the dead, then regardless of how long the earth got to get here and the method in which we got here, if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is still very much true. So I think it's a mistake if a church says, hey, you have to believe in literal six-day creation in order to be a Christian. Agree?
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that one, Joel. That's kind of seems like a gimme. In all the conversations I have with non-believers, when that issue comes up, it's something that's being used as a barrier between them and coming to faith. It's not the primary issue there, and it's not a primary issue in salvation either.
Exactly. I respect Francis Collins, and Francis Collins runs Biologos, which is progressive creationism in their philosophy, which is essentially theistic evolution. It's another word for that.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the scientists that mapped the human genome. He knows what he's talking about. I am perfectly happy to hear his arguments about it. And that's, as an apologist, that you end up taking that approach, at least if you're a successful one, that, you really want people to hear you out, listen to the evidence, weigh it, consider it, and come to the best conclusion based on the evidence. And so you have to adopt that attitude yourself. And when it comes to areas of science, I'm not a scientist. So the best I can do is hear a scientist say, well, the evidence tells us this. What they just told me is what the evidence tells us. They didn't tell me what the evidence was. So it's almost an issue of authority at that point. You're trusting the scientists because they're wearing a lab coat, not because you know the details.
Right.
So yeah, I'm agnostic on the subject of origins. I'm not writing off young Earth creationism or old Earth creationism. I need more evidence before I can draw a conclusion on that. And I think I can go through life and still get to heaven not having drawn a conclusion on that.
I think that's a fair take on it, Joel. I lean towards old Earth creationism, but again, I could be swayed one way or another evidentially.
Yeah, well, at this point we're chatting. I'll tell you that my field, besides psychology, is astronomy. That's something I've been interested in since third grade. I've been reading all the astronomy books I can find. I own my own telescope. I read the books and the journals, and I listen to the podcasts and the news. So it's, again, point being, I may not have a degree in it, but I'm informed at the very least. And the young Earth creationism, they do a decent job explaining away the geological stuff, how the Earth seems older geologically than it actually is, using the flood. And I don't know enough about tectonics and other subjects, meteorology and so forth, to weigh how accurate their data is for the flood, but I'm willing to take it as given. My problem is the cosmology. I'm not really,
exactly.
I'm not really sure how we can get the universe as it currently appears without taking a little more time than they give us.
Right. It involves monkeying with the laws of physics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at any rate, I'm not here to give the final word on that. I'm just laying out the problem as it stands. There's this very science versus Christianity feeling in the atmosphere. From the Christian side, it's that, well, all scientists are wrong unless they're also Christians who believe in six-day creationism. And from the secular standpoint, it's that the church are these stodgy Southern lawyers standing in the courtroom, waving their finger at the young history teacher or science teacher that's just trying to educate kids with current science. That sort of profile that was given in this movie. Again, the movie was a fictionalization of an actual event, so it just kind of there to make fun of Christians almost. But nonetheless, I want to talk about history here, since we're on that subject. First, Let's look at the Bible. You get this argument from Lawrence Krauss and others, and the argument goes like this. If the Bible was inspired by God, you should see some crazy advanced mathematical proofs or scientific revelations in there. And the absence of this evidence is just a book written by Bronze Age morons, because you don't have that. You heard this one?
Oh, yeah. Lawrence Krauss loves to bring it out in every debate he's in.
True stuff. All right. Well, let's talk about that for a second. What I look at when I see this argument is not what the scripture doesn't say in terms of, giving proof, but what it doesn't say in terms when you compare it to contemporary texts. So if you look at the other stuff that was being said and written during the time the Bible was being written, you've got pagan mythology, right? You've got the Egyptians, and they think the Nile is divine and the sun is the Eye of Ra. Well, a little understanding of science is going to discredit that religion, because you find out what the sun actually is and how the Nile actually works via science, and you can tell that these are not entities in and of themselves. Then you've got the Greeks who think lightning is tossed down by Zeus, and the sun is the chariot of Apollo, volcanoes are the forge of Vulcan, etc. Again, apply a little science, you've dismantled the religion. And so on. I mean, you've got like the Vikings, they think the sea is the blood of frost giants and lightning is Thor's hammer.
Feel heaven's wrath!
And so on. Now, those are what other religions are doing around the same time the Bible is written. They're using mythology to explain how the world around them functions. Once you see how the world actually functions, science replaces religion, just like atheists think that it has done. But then if you look at the Jewish scriptures, God is pretty aloof from his creation. He isn't blowing winds from his mouth or grabbing the earth and giving it a good shaking to cause earthquakes or so on. In fact, if you look at the end of the book of Job, God pegs Job with a series of questions asking him if he can explain how these phenomena function. Job admits he can't, and the conversation ends. God doesn't say, well, that's me, spitting in the wind or whatnot to cause it. Basically, God says, hey, look, here's the world around you. It's ordered. You don't know how it's ordered. And the point being that the Bible doesn't try to explain how the physical world works. Instead, it focuses on the relationship of man and God. So whereas pagan mythology, pagan religion was there to explain the mechanics of the physical universe, the Bible doesn't try to do that. It doesn't speak to the mechanics of the physical universe. It speaks to the nature of man and the relationship of man to God. So when science comes along and explains the laws of physics, and it doesn't defeat Christianity, because that was never the point of Christianity. In the Bible, God is distinctly transcendent above his creation versus dwelling on Mount Olympus or whatnot. Now, if we're going to be honest, the Bible endorses some kind of intelligent design, meaning everything that exists got here by means of an intelligent designer. But taking that mindset actually encourages the scientific endeavor. What I mean is that unlike the naturalist scientist who is motivated to find out how the universe works by sheer curiosity, the Christian scientist, and I mean a scientist who is a Christian, not a Christian scientist. Cults are your thing, Caleb, so I'll let you talk about Christian scientists if you ever get around.
Fair enough.
The Christian scientist is essentially trying to reverse engineer the structure of the universe to find out how it was designed to work. The motivation is different, but the result is the same. And so I give the example of, well, for a kid, I say the sun. You know, a kid says, Daddy, why does the sun shine? And you say, well, it shines to give us warmth and light and to allow the plants to grow. And, you know, nothing you've said is untrue, but you're giving a purpose to the sun. You know, scientifically you could say that, well, it's a thermonuclear process in the core of the sun which sends photons out, and get the details, the mechanical details. So you've just explained how it shines, or to the kid you explain why it shines.
So you're saying you don't explain.
Go ahead.
So you're saying you don't explain to your kids that the sun is a burning ball of fire in the sun that's going to absolutely explode one day and kill us all?
No,
that's not your bedtime story?
I tell them
the sun is a mass of incandescent gas, a gigantic nuclear furnace.
The sun is a mass of incandescent gas. There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
But, okay, so the Bible doesn't tell us that God, you know, is at a hand crank making the universe function or balancing the earth on his back or whatnot. So the early Christians, unlike early pagans, weren't shackled by having this presupposition that the universe was a certain way, and therefore they had to embrace those beliefs and reject any kind of interrogation into how it actually works. They were free to question and explore the physical universe, and they were motivated to do so because of this idea that, you know, God encourages exploration and intuition. So as a result, practically every field of science was pioneered by a Christian, and most of the significant early discoveries were made by Christians. I tried looking into fields created or pioneered by Christians, and it was such a long list I couldn't get through it. Just to name a couple, you've got Roger Bacon, who was the founding scientist for the scientific method. William of Ockham, of course, did Occam's razor. You got Galileo, Copernicus, and Kepler, who pioneered astronomy and laid out pretty much everything we already currently know about astronomy. And then Newton discovered all the laws of physics. So Christians also created every major field, such as botany, zoology, biology, chemistry, math, genetics, etc. So what's my takeaway here? Well, first, I recently did a series interviewing a bunch of major scientists who were Christians. At the end of the day, the number of scientists who are Christians averages the same percentage of the population that are Christians. So our side isn't underrepresented in the scientific fields. This idea that the scientific institution is at war with Christianity has more to do with the gateway of dissemination. A scientist publishing a paper isn't going to bring religion into the paper because scientific paper is just a statement of raw facts and findings. No one's going to publish a study of soil samples and then start talking about God. So there's that. And then there's this tendency on the part of the church to dismiss various scientific studies that might run contrary to broadly accepted notions of creationism or global warming or such. So it creates a narrative which is broadly untrue. My idea is that we accept the data for what it is and try to be as fair as possible when we consider it. And this is what we were talking about before. As an apologist, you want others to weigh evidence and come to a conclusion that fits the evidence, so you kind of have to do that yourself or risk being hypocritical. There's a lot of theories out there, and we don't have to jump on one just because it matches our preconceived notions. I have good reason to not believe in Darwinian evolution, but none of them are based strictly on the Bible. I think the theory has a lot of scientific holes in it, but if I'm ever convinced otherwise, I can just align myself with Biologos and Francis Collins. Point being that science is essentially created by Christians, and there aren't any scientific studies that could disprove the miraculous. At the end of the day, as long as we can allow for miracles, nothing we believe biblically can be falsified. All right, that's what I got. Final thoughts on that, Caleb?
I think you're on the right track there, Joel, and I think, you know, an important distinction too there in regards to the sciences and the atheistic worldview versus the Christian worldview is the Christian worldview has a reason for looking at nature being ordered and having these principles at play within it that are logical and things that we can study and find a logical order to. An atheistic worldview lacks reason for logic to exist, especially within the universe in that capacity. So I think you're on the right track with that, and I wish that it was something that more churches would adopt in general, is that kind of approach of let's let the scientists look at it, let's see what's going on here, and let's not have a panic attack over every little thing that may challenge our worldview, because if it's true, we've got nothing to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, okay, so you know what a Dimetrodon is?
No, not off the top of my head.
It's a dinosaur that's not a dinosaur, based on when it lived. You've probably seen pictures of them. It's this big lizard-looking thing with a huge frill coming off of its back. It's just this big fin that sticks up off of its back for no reason. So you're going to have a scientist who's a Christian and a scientist who's an atheist looking at that, and they're both going to ask the same question. They're going to ask, well, what's that for? What's that big frill do? Now, they both begin with the assumption that it serves some kind of purpose. It isn't just there. It actually has a function to it. Now, the Christian is going to have that intuitive idea, firstly, because pretty much everything we see has a reason or a purpose to it, especially biologically. You don't see any kind of critter running around with something hanging off their body that doesn't do anything. Everything that we see in nature serves some kind of function. Now, from a naturalist, they're going to come to the conclusion that, hey, it just got there because it was useful, and so it continued to expand over generations through selective breeding. Well, maybe that's the case, but point is, it serves a function. The idea that something exists for some kind of purpose or has some kind of function doesn't stop science. It's intuitive. Scientists already think that. They just have different reasons for thinking it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So you're going to tell us about the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, right, Caleb?
Yeah. A slightly different approach, kind of a 300-foot view of things. So I find myself rotating between a lot of various religion and worldview studies on kind of a 6-9 month rotation. It just seems that that's kind of the time frame that falls together for me really diving in and studying a particular worldview, and it usually takes at least that long to kind of really grasp the core tenets of a lot of these worldviews. And the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, also known as the Jehovah's Witnesses, has kind of been my target for the last 6 months or so.
Okay.
So how familiar are you with the JWs, as I will lovingly refer to them from here on out?
Yeah, I was intentionally using their actual name to obfuscate to listeners what we were really talking about. All right, Jehovah's Witnesses. I have had explained to me their exact principles and beliefs, but you know, it's been years. It's usually years between when I hear what they're actually about. So the thing I know about them is that they believe that Jesus was the first created being and that he's the highest created being. He's like a super angel or something like that. And that's the only thing about them that I really can recall, except for the fact that they keep prophesying the end of days and getting it wrong.
Yeah, they do have a habit of doing that every half a century or so. And you're on track with the kind of super angel theory of Jesus as well, and we may get into that a little bit more. What has been the general consensus, and this kind of ties back into our first topic as well, what have you seen as the general consensus among Christian churches you've been to in regards to what they teach and say about the Jehovah's Witnesses?
Well, they would say that Jehovah's Witnesses is kind of an offshoot of Christianity, that somehow it evolved off of Christianity through broad doctrinal problems, ones that were really answered early in Christian history. I mean, you've got the Council of Nicaea sitting down and hashing out the nature of Christ. So the fact that the JWs hundreds of years later decided that wasn't orthodoxy anymore, I don't know the history of them enough to figure out exactly how they got there. But yeah, I mean, that's the idea in churches, is that, hey, they don't believe in Jesus. Here are the verses you got to talk to them out of Hebrews. Here are the verses they're going to throw at you out of Hebrews. And then they sat down and wrote their own version of the Bible in order to, get rid of the pesky verses that might counter-indicate their beliefs.
Well, you've certainly been to some better informed churches than I have, Joel, in that regard. A lot of the consensus, again, from my background in a very Southern Baptist type upbringing, was that, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons are cults. You shouldn't invite them in. You should avoid them at all costs. They are dangerous, and really kind of that approach. So not even quite to the level of kind of what you're describing there.
Well, churches I've been to, they really encourage you to engage with them as, for the purpose of evangelism. And so, they'll kind of draw out the broad ideas that you need to be talking to them about. And I've had it explained to me that they really know their stuff, so you got to be pretty savvy to talk to them about it.
Yeah, exactly. And going into this and kind of really diving in and really studying their beliefs and looking at what was going on with them, I kind of had three major concerns, coming from even less knowledge than the churches have kind of prepared you with. And my three main concerns were, are they Christians? Are they saved? Are they a cult? And what should Christian responses be to them? So a lot of that stuff you've already got is kind of already there. I still had some of these questions coming in, and despite the fact that I can read that and figure out what's going on with them, it's when you really get into the personal conversations with people that you see how this faith plays out in a daily life and how the church has actually impacted their journey of faith.
Well, they're not true Christians unless they believe in six-day creationism, so.
Well, as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, they are all old earth creationists by demand. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has laid that out for them, that you will believe the earth is 4.5 billion years old. That's how it is.
Dang, I did not know that. I would have guessed the other way.
Yeah, they are old earth and global flood.
Okay.
Which is a unique combination you don't always see.
Yeah, true. I mean, I get broadly where they're coming from and broadly where they're wrong. Again, I don't know enough about the details to engage on the topic very much. I can tell you, do you remember when we had finished writing the Mentionals project and there was this publisher that agreed to publish for us?
Yes.
Okay. The guy who ran that publisher was a former JW.
Okay.
So if you remember how bizarre his doctrinal statements he wanted us to sign were?
Yeah.
That might explain it a little bit.
Very, very true. And I've noticed that with people I've talked to that have come out of the Jehovah's Witnesses as well. They kind of have a hard time still grasping some of the Christian concepts, like the Trinity, for example. Mm-hmm. Even coming out of that, they're left with a lot of bizarre and kind of this implanted doctrine that they've received from the Watchtower. So in looking at kind of, and I think this speaks to your point a little bit too, is my biggest question was, are they Christians? Are they saved? Because if I'm going to be engaging these people for a long period of time, that's kind of the core thing I want to get to, is if we have doctrinal differences, are they a salvation issue?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've found that kind of the best way to start engaging them, and I was lucky in this regard that I work in an area where it's a downtown area, and they happen to set up on a weekly basis down there. So I get these repeated encounters with them when I'm going on a walk for lunch, and get a chance to just really hammer them with questions.
Wow, feet on the ground research. I appreciate that.
Yeah, exactly. And now, admittedly, though, my first few encounters with them were very, very zealous and involved a lot of heavy argumentation over some of the points they would bring up. So it was not the most gentle and respectful approach to begin with. Mm-hmm. But given the repeated encounters, I've had a chance to develop some better relationships with them and get a little bit more of the foot in the door to have some deeper conversations than I initially started with. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, some of these initial conversations with them were very deceptive in a sense, in that a lot of general questions, a lot of things you would think to ask, or even some of the important points that we would try to engage in as believers with Jehovah's Witnesses. For example, the Trinity, or the deity of Christ. In trying to engage a lot of these points, they're very well prepared by the Watchtower to defend their perspective from the Scriptures on these issues. Mm-hmm. So, and in talking with them, they use so much of the same terminology that we do. It can seem as if they're on the same team in a certain sense. And for probably, first dozen or so encounters, I began leaning toward the fact, okay, maybe this is a group with some really messed up doctrine, but they still hold to salvation through Christ. So, maybe they are under the Christian umbrella as C.S. Lewis would have it, okay, in Mere Christianity. Mm-hmm. But the deeper you get, it starts to really tweak kind of what you're seeing about them, particularly in personal relationships. Mm-hmm. And I do want to make something very clear. Having spoken to quite a few Jehovah's Witnesses now, I'm fairly convinced that I've met at least a handful who were saved.
Okay.
They profess Christ in a way that is very genuine. Their works are very fruitful in the sense that it's what you would see with a Christian. Mm-hmm. An interesting observation that came out of this, though, is that the people that I have talked to, they've seen the most genuine in terms of expressing Christ to me in our conversations were those who actually originally grew up in a Christian background and were later drawn into the Jehovah's Witnesses. Mm-hmm. I haven't got as much of a sense of a true understanding of Christ from those who grew up in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Mm-hmm. So the key question that kind of popped up for me when it finally dawned on me, okay, what do I need to ask to get to the bottom of this? Was here's salvation as I understand it. Okay. Jesus died as a perfect sacrifice for my sins, mm-hmm. and I am saved by grace through faith alone. Mm-hmm. I said, do you consider me saved? With me expressing that as a genuine belief, do you consider that enough to have me saved? And they said, well, that's part of it. Uh-huh. And so I was immediately taken back by this and asked, well, what do you mean a part of it? And this is when they went into detail about what salvation was in their view, which did include Jesus' sacrifice.
Sure.
But you also have to worship God by his true name, do kingdom work, tell people about the kingdom, and not be a part of the world.
Seems like a lot of work to get yourself through the gates of heaven.
Exactly. So it's definitely a faith plus kind of deal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's setting aside the major issues I have with the doctrine of God giving a sacrifice who is completely innocent but not himself, which is a major impingement on the justice of God.
Sure.
But with that said, as after that answer, I kind of had a very clear picture that Jehovah's Witness doctrine is not Christian in any way, shape, or form, even though some of the members have been blessed with a truth despite this muddled swamp of twisted scripture the Watchtower has thrown at them.
Mm-hmm.
So, Joel, out of the Jehovah's Witness personal testimonies, what do you think came up as the reason most accept Jehovah's Witnesses as God's true religion on earth?
Well, it largely seems to me to be a lack of exposure to the larger world of doctrine. And it's what you see a lot in these extreme, I'll say legalistic institutions, is that the first thing they tell you is that everybody outside the institution is evil. And therefore, you get really interested in not being evil, and so you kind of have to follow what the institution tells you to do, regardless, because you don't want to be like them outsiders, boy. Now, as far as coming around to that viewpoint, my impression, and this is just of extreme fundamentalism in general, which I would hold the JWs to. I think it's born out of a soup of legalism and fundamentalism in the derogatory sense, is that there is one thing that really is attractive about fundamentalism, and it is this idea of absolute certainty, that there is no agnosticism. You know exactly how things are, and you have to defend that at all costs. And I think actually this ties back into the young earth creationism. If you're setting this up as absolutely essential to be true in order to, be correct about things, and then a person were to convince you, say, that there wasn't a worldwide flood, and then you become an atheist. I mean, that's a huge leap. To be convinced that there wasn't a worldwide flood, therefore God doesn't exist. But that's the thing about fundamentalism, and I would say it's probably true of Jehovah's Witness, is that you're given this framework that's a complete worldview off the shelf. It's all boxed up for you, all the pieces are included, you put them together, that's your worldview. And that kind of certainty that you know exactly how things are can be pretty attractive. And as the church has become more ecumenical and secular in nature, people have stopped being so certain about every little detail and have been open to, hearing the different arguments. JWs are not like that. That's why I wonder how they would approach an atheist with all the questions that we always have to handle. Caleb, I mean, if they went through the, 15-question video what we're doing now, what would their answers be?
Right, and that's one of the two things that caught my attention, because eventually they'll all get to their personal testimonies as to why they came to the Watchtower. And it does carry that double-edged sword. Like you said, it offers this complete packaged worldview that's all ready for you. And that was part of one of the things attractive to most of them, is that the Jehovah's Witnesses offer answers to these questions. I've seen them engage with atheists when I've been there talking, and they can honestly answer and respond to questions better than a lot of Christians I've seen.
Well, jumping in on that point for just a second, the gentleman I was talking about, the publisher that I was talking to you about earlier, that was a former JW. If you look at the library that they've published, it is exhaustive, and he carries that sort of, having an answer for everything kind of zeal over into his evangelical life now. And speaking of evangelical, evangelism is a huge deal for JWs. I think it's part of the kingdom work. It's something you have to do. And
right. If you'll lose your membership and your status within the church if you're not out there so many hours a month.
Right. And you were talking about testimony, how people came to be JWs. It's a numbers game. It's like being at the bar and asking every single woman to go out with you. You're eventually going to get a hit just by sheer numbers.
Right.
And the same thing's true of JWs. If they knock on every single door in America, they're going to get a couple of converts just by sheer averages.
And we'll have to save that for another discussion. Talking about interesting forms of evangelism, the Children of God cult and their flirty fishing definitely takes the cake as the most odd and interesting form of evangelism you'll ever find out about. But we'll have to save that as a tidbit for another episode.
Can't wait.
So in kind of getting back to this as well, the other thing that drew a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses to the organization is the community. So when they do their evangelism, at least initially, they offer a very real sense of community and love on the people that do join their group. I mean, these are, between being able to give answers to people and genuinely loving on people. Now, we could argue about the genuine part of that if it's a requirement for you to be out there doing this anyway.
Sure.
But, these are not bad methods, and we as Christians in other denominations could certainly learn a lot from their methodology, at least in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of move on a little bit from that, my next area of concern was, okay, are they an actual cult? So they're not saved in general, for the most part, as best I can tell. And of course, I can't say for certain of anybody's heart, but in general, the Jehovah's Witness doctrine does not lead to salvation because it doesn't point you down the right path for it. But the next main concern I had was, are they a cult? So is this something that it's worth really devoting my time and energy into to try and give people some clues as to a possible way out? So you're a psych guy too. So tell me a little bit about what are some signs of a cult that you might be familiar with.
I was thinking about that with us co-hosting. There's a little psychological redundancy at this point.
Right.
Oh, well.
Hey, somebody's got to do something with their psych degree, right?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't even want my psych degree.
I did up until the last year, and then I realized I was in possibly the wrong path since there wasn't much I could do with it at that point.
Well, not to get too personal, but I was going after an education degree. Then they shut the department down at the last second and gave me all the wrong advice to get my my degree, to the point where I had to shift majors at the last second just to be able to graduate on time.
Ouch.
Yeah, so that's how I got my psych degree. Anyway, cults.
Yeah.
So one of the things that really struck me, you were just talking about, again, I don't know all the details you do. I knew that there was a very strong community in Jehovah's Witnesses, but I didn't realize that they were commanded as part of the kingdom work to go around and love on each other and just be a community, gosh darn it. But yeah, that's a one of the hallmarks of a cult is just this really, it's a community, and it's almost an enforced community. You have to get together and display real affection for one another. And you see this in the communes in the 60s. A lot of those fit all of the hallmarks of a cult. You had lots of drug use. You had a charismatic figure. I'm thinking here of, what's the name of that guy, the Helter Skelter guy that had all those women do all those murders for him?
Charles Manson.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking of Charles Manson. I mean, that hits all the hallmarks of the cult right there. You had a charismatic figure that everybody was revolved around. He was kind of involved with everybody in the cult, meaning that he had all the chicks to himself. There was drug use involved. You get them hooked on something, and then you threaten to remove it. And honestly, psychology. Let's talk about behavioralism. You think about behavioralism. You use a variety of things to encourage behavior. You use punishment, reward, and you use positive and negative enforcement. And so it's kind of like reverse negative enforcement, this idea that if you leave, you're going to lose this community. And so you're taking away something very positive. You're taking yourself out of this very positive soup that you really feel comfortable in. And so that's a good reason to stay right there, is just so you can continue to have this strong, loving support and community. You don't question the ideas because you don't want to lose the environment. And then, honestly, as a cult, I would associate cults specifically with a person or teachings that are unquestionable. You as an individual are not allowed to question the leader or the doctrine itself. And so, in the early church, not in the early church, in the Reformed era of the church, they took the Latin Vulgate and they translated it into the native languages and then got Bibles out to everybody so they could all see what they were believing, and each person could make their own assumptions and come to their own conclusions based on what they were reading, versus just having to take what the authority was telling you as read. And so that's the nature of a cult, is that you as an individual are trained to parrot what you're being told, not to think about and come to your own conclusions from what you're being told.
Right. And I think, there's some scary connotations there into some of what we see and we're talking about in the first segment in regards to church stances on science and particularly their view on creationism. But, I wouldn't put that in the area of a cult, but it's certainly one of those things that plays out the same way.
Well, honestly, I would say that your church, Universal, is always in danger of having sections teeter off into cults, just like the JWs did. I'm sure that at some point that came off of the Church Catholic and capital C on Catholic, and became its own thing. It didn't get born the way it was. It developed.
Right, they actually splintered from the Seventh-day Adventists.
Right. So there you go. And the church is always in danger of doing that. But, you get this argument sometimes that Christianity can't be true because there's so many different denominations out there all teaching their own thing. And my response to that is that that's a hallmark of intellectual freedom. The fact that I can grab some people from my church, say, yeah, I'm not sure about how this is being taught, open scripture, show them what I'm talking about from my own perspective, and then guess what? They get to decide which one was right. So the fact that there's so many denominations just means that in Christianity, we're intellectually free. We're not bound to one leader telling us what's true or one doctrine we can't. We get to look at it. When I go to church every Sunday, I bring my Bible. Everybody around me has a Bible. The reason that we're not just listening to the pastor without a Bible is that we're checking up on what he's saying against Scripture. We're comparing what he's saying against Scripture, and we're forming our own conclusions. It's a checks and balances system within the church that allows us to correct false doctrine and excise false teachers.
Exactly. And you see exactly the opposite play out with the JWs. I went to how I made this decision. I'm not quite sure. It was half spur of the moment, half temporary insanity, perhaps. But I made the decision to attend one of their regional conferences and just see what was going on. So
that's some extreme apologetics. You're like the Steve Irwin of apologists.
It was, especially when I showed up in shorts and a T-shirt, and everybody else is decked out to the nines. So it's not like I stood out or anything.
Okay, I'm going to have to follow up on the Steve Irwin apologist thing. I'm seeing you out of the street in your khakis. A JW's coming up, and you're like, "Oh, this one's a beauty." Come here, little fella.
Except we'd have to change it to a Southern Steve Irwin in this case.
Oh well.
But I guess the Southern Australia accent works too.
Wow. I'd love to hear it.
So in attending this conference and kind of seeing what it was about, which I went with one other person, and we were eventually removed politely from the event because we had too many questions. But
that's like you knocking on the JW's door.
Exactly. It was amusing in a certain sense, and don't get me wrong, we were polite, so it was all very cordial removal, kind of passive aggressive situation.
Just like God told us to be.
Yeah. But the situation was very interesting because what you see is they gather for this teaching at certain periods of the year, as well as how this plays out in their individual churches, and they're given videos and they're given routine teaching that is laid out by the Watchtower in a way that even the individual teachers of this, they don't have any pastors or anything, but they have elders who lead services, lay this out in a way that is very specific, and there's no variance. So it's everybody around the country and all the JWs in the world are receiving the same teaching at the same time, and it's the same material. There isn't that variance or checks and balances present that you mentioned within the church at large. Mm-hmm. This is a completely different methodology, and it falls within a lot of those things we were talking about. You know, there's isolation tactics there. There's underhanded threats. There's opposition to independent thinking. They don't encourage higher education among members. There's fear of any kind of outside education. They don't allow. They tell you don't Google Jehovah's Witnesses. You stick with jw.org, and that's it.
Huh.
There's a certain amount of
Stay
charismatic.
off Facebook, right?
Well, some of them are on there, but they need to avoid anything that relates remotely to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Okay.
It's an odd set of rules, but essentially they'll close their ears and hide as soon as you bring out anything that could be a work of Satan.
What are their politics like?
Oh, well, in regards to national politics or within the organization itself?
National politics.
They're completely neutral. At least that's what they claim. They claim to be neutral. They don't vote. They don't get involved in elections. They don't get involved in political debates at all.
Weird.
Even on moral issues such as abortion, they would not stand up one way or another on abortion because that's a national policy, and they want to maintain neutrality. They don't want to get involved in anything national.
Bizarre.
Yes, and it certainly comes
into
and it comes into some major conflicts with some of the actual ways they handle things, because that neutrality does not extend throughout the organization in the same way that they try and portray it.
No, nobody can be truly neutral.
Right, exactly. And this bleeds over into everything they do. That's just one example of how they do this lifestyle micromanagement. And they do extensive training and indoctrination planning in a way that is just on a scale it's hard to imagine until you really start watching some of their videos. And then, of course, another thing you see a lot with cults is kind of hidden practices, methods, and motivations, things that are under the surface that, most of the the general members don't see.
Yeah.
And of all these, you really see this within the Watchtower and the JWs in some way, shape, or form. And some of their most disturbing practices include, the shunning, which a lot of people have heard about at this point, and their strict control of all teaching avenues and personal Bible study.
It's getting back to the previous thing you were talking about, this idea that there are secret practices and so forth. This is something you see in cults, is that there's this sort of hierarchy that you have to elevate through by various rituals or, beliefs. You see this in the Mormon Church where, you have to perform certain rites before you move on to the next level, so to speak.
Right.
You get more revelation at that level and so forth. And you see it definitely in Scientology, where they actually have published material that you're not allowed to have access to until you advance to the next level. So,
and it's exactly the same with the JWs. But one of the interesting things I discovered in some of my research was this book called Shepherding the Flock of God, I believe it is. And it's a book that's only given to elders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so protected and secretive among the group that if you're going to have this book laminated, as they do much of their materials, you have to, give it to another elder. They don't even let sisters, which are all the female believers within the group, anywhere near this book. Wow. Females can't be elders, and they can't even touch this book, even if their husband has a copy because he's an elder.
I wonder if you can find a pirated PDF of it online.
Oh, yeah, I've read it.
Wow, you really did your research. I'm impressed, bro.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, when you do ask Jehovah's Witness sisters if they're familiar with this book. The look on their faces is pretty priceless because many of them aren't even aware that it exists.
Really?
Yeah.
Dang.
So
right,
again,
you have got to start filming some of your adventures on the street.
I've thought about it. I need to get a little bit more covert camera, and I don't want to set them off too much. I've developed some good relationships with most of them, so but I would certainly enjoy, at the very least, recording for practice purposes.
Now carry a selfie stick out behind you. It'll work.
Hey, that would work. Hey, we may try it. There's plenty of videos on YouTube of people doing it.
And they'll ask you what the selfie stick is, and you'll be like, what, this? There's just better reception for my cell phone.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they would buy it, but, it might be worth a shot. Last but not least, before kind of wrapping up on this whole thing, I would like to touch briefly on kind of Christian responses to the JWs. And, if you happen to bump into one of their carts where they show up at your door, what is a typical Christian need to be prepared for? And it goes back to our very first point that you mentioned that you had heard in church is you need to use caution. I was caught very off guard by a lot of the things that Jehovah's Witnesses brought up, even someone who's been in apologetics for a number of years now. Mm-hmm. Their individual approach and how they're trained question-wise definitely catches you off guard. And it caused me to pause and go back and do a lot of study, which was a good thing of engaging them.
Sure.
I know more about the Hebrew in the Bible now and actually studying the Hebrew than I did prior to engaging the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Huh.
Because their translation, the New World Translation, adds a lot of significant things to the Bible. So in order to argue against it, you have to use their own materials. And they happen to have an interlinear translation, which contains both the Hebrew and the English word. And their interlinear translation contradicts the New World Translation in a lot of places.
Huh.
So in doing so, I got a lot more familiar with some of the original Hebrew than I thought I would in preparing for my conversations with them.
Hebrew, huh? So they argue from the Old Testament more?
A little bit. They will use a lot of tactics to kind of throw you off course. And as a Christian, they will avoid going to the New World Translation with you for a long time. And they'll try and stick to the King James or something that more Christians are familiar with. And they'll stick to passages that, aren't the ones that they needed to alter to get, their truest translation.
Sure.
So they will argue all over the place and back and forth, translation-wise, as well as, they're also experienced in some of the Hebrew verses that they've been taught, so they'll know how to go to the Hebrew and say this means this.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only in the certain verses that they're more familiar with that the church has set them up to use.
Sure.
So in addition to really being cautious with them and being prepared that engaging with them will take additional study and it will be a challenge on a lot of levels, which as an apologist and as a Christian, I think the challenge is a good thing because truth will hold up to scrutiny. But in addition to that, of course, we've always got to remember to be gracious and loving. And with the Jehovah's Witnesses, because our doctrines are so different and many of the topics they'll bring up can hit such a fine point of sensitivity, it's a challenge to continue to be gracious and loving with them in a lot of these conversations. Mm-hmm. And that's something that has worked out well in some of the best of the conversations I had, is to remember that building this relationship with them is the only way they're going to listen to anything I have to say anyway.
Well, I've never read it, but I've heard that the book Kingdom of the Cults gives you a lot of insight into how it runs and how they think.
It's an excellent book, and John Ankerberg also has some good books out there on cults in general as well that give a nice overview of a lot of different cults.
Yeah, Scientology?
Oh, yeah.
All right. It's the one I'm worried about.
Yeah, I was down in Clearwater a couple of weeks ago and almost stopped and took a picture outside the Church of Scientology, but I really didn't want anybody following me home, so I went ahead and passed on that.
What? That happens?
Yeah, they're a little bit crazy in terms of how they hunt down people who are against the church in any way.
Oh,
yeah.
Freaky. So it's like the opposite of JWs.
Yeah, pretty much. They will do some interesting things to make your life miserable.
Wow. My wife was in New York, and she went into a Scientology church up there just to see what it was about. And she had a fairly nice experience. Nobody's hunted us down that I'm aware of.
Well, that's good. And I'm sure it's probably more leaning towards the apostates and people who've turned away from the church.
Oh, well.
With most of the cults, that's how it is. If you're an apostate, you're doomed in one way, shape, or form.
That's an interesting point. You think about all of these cases, like from ex-pastor, for instance, where you have all these ministers that were in the church for years being atheists in the pulpit, and you'd probably never find that in the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right. No, exactly. And
it shows how open and earnest a church and a Christian church atmosphere can be, that you can still remain part of the body even if you disagree.
Yeah, and that's how it should be. That's a sign of something that is, completely outside of this cult atmosphere that you see with some of these other groups. Mm. And I have to say, kind of to wrap all this up a little bit too, is in addition to all that I've kind of learned in my study of the JWs, one of the biggest takeaways has been how we can relate that back to the church and the importance of apologetics in the lives of believers. The JWs have taken that piece, and they've of course taken it their cult direction to turn it into something else. But our preparation in building up each other and building up the church to be prepared to take on these questions is something that a lot of us have fallen down on the job on, at least from, a lot of the churches I grew up in and people I have talked to about their experiences in church.
There's an interesting intersection between your section and mine here, because in my section I was talking about how you should be able to look at the evidence, follow it where it leads, and not be afraid of violating some kind of larger doctrine, because the evidence is there for all of us to see. And we talked about that in terms of the Scripture. The Scripture is in every language. It's something that any of us can open and read. And so we are informed in the central document that we all operate from in order to get our theology. And again, I said disagreement is the hallmark of intellectual freedom, versus the JWs where disagreement is anathema. If our churches get to the point where they say, hey, you got to be a six-day creationist or else, then we're drifting in the direction of the JWs, the cult. It should be more, it should be more of a freedom of thought. Here is the Scripture. Here's what it says. This is what exegetes have said about it. Here are the conclusions that this minister has come to based on the text. Explain your reasoning. Lay the argument out there, but don't just wave your finger and say, you have to believe the way I say or else. And if I ever talk to this pastor, what I've said to him was that I don't adopt positions I can't argue for. That's not to say that I'm, firmly against six-day creationism. If I can't argue for it convincingly to myself, it's not a position I adopt. I don't deny it. I don't adopt it. I don't take positions on things until... Another thing is eschatology, right? So there are so many different theories about end times prophecy out there, and it's a big contentious area.
Right.
But it's not one in which I've really sat down and done the work researching to come to a firm conclusion on. So I don't adopt positions about it yet, because I haven't really studied it to that degree. And if we go away saying, well, I believe this because the pastor told me so, we're in some dangerous territory right there. You should believe it because you can argue for it. And that's the education. The church should be an education institute for that reason.
Absolutely. 100% in agreement with you there, Joe.
Yep. That about it?
I think so.
All right. So that wraps it up for another episode. Before we go, you want to pitch Subjected to Truth for us, Caleb?
Yeah. Please, anybody listening, go over, check out subjectedtotruth.wordpress.com. I've got some articles up over there with a variety of subjects, everything from cosmic horror to the resurrection. So check it out.
That's a narrow leap right there. I mean, you're going to do cosmic horror, you might as well do the resurrection. All right. Well, it's a growing website. Follow Caleb and see if you can help him grow some more. Be sure to visit our website, thementionables.com. And it's not thementionables.com. thementionables.org. Follow us on Facebook, and our Twitter account is @mentionables1. We're still running our YouTube series on questions no Christian can answer. Caleb is a big contributor to that series. Tough questions, right, Caleb?
Not really.
Some real head scratchers in there.
Yeah.
You remember the time when the guy asked why there are so many religions if Christianity is true? And then that time when the other guy asked a totally different question about why Christianity is true if there are so many religions?
Yeah, and then that other time when that guy asked about why Christianity was true if there were so many religions?
Yeah, that was hard.
Yeah, I know. But for the answers, you're going to have to go check out the videos.
That's right. Releasing every Thursday. Hopefully I'll have one out this Thursday. All right. Well, Caleb and I and a couple of others wrote a book together, The Mentionables Project, available on Kindle through Amazon, or you can get a hard copy from our website, thementionables.org. All right, that's it. Keep on listening and keep on mentioning. And we're out.
All right.